Ladies and gentlemen, Mrs. Markham Walsh.
Thank you for being here. We are all here to honor International Holocaust Remembrance. It actually was on January 26th, so we're a little bit late with it, but better now than ever. But that's why I did this, and it's why I'm talking to you, and it's why I have talked to many groups all over the country. And it is, I guess, to reinforce what the Jewish people continually say: never forget and never again. And I've had cousins who say, "Why do you do this?" And I say, "Because I'm supposed to." And I can't explain it any further than that. But it's a reminder to all of us how unbelievably blessed, how unbelievably lucky we are. And some of the people that you'll meet in this book were not so blessed or so lucky. Incidentally, there are enough books up here for each of you to pick one up as you leave. I'm happy to give them to you. And besides that, DeWitt said he would not haul them home. He and Harvey haul them down, and they both told me that they're not taking back any, so please pick up your copy, because I have no way to get it back to Nashville. The lady who is the heroine in this became an unbelievably precious friend. I visited her in Branford, Connecticut 5 times. The first time I went up, and this is all in the book, I read his obituary in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and I thought, what amazing courage. I'm going to call his family and tell him, because he was instrumental in the largest escape from any Nazi camp, Sobibor Death Camp. I called Branford, Connecticut. That was an AP release from Branford in the New York Times, and I used his name and came up with a phone number. I called and left a message and said, "This is Ann Walsh. I'm very interested in family of Chaim Engel. I want to tell them how much I enjoy, how much I appreciate and love the courage that he showed in that prison escape." And about 2 days later, I received a return message, and it said, "What kind of accent do you have?" That was her message. So I called her back and I said, "Mine's Southern, what's yours?" Because hers was still heavy Dutch. That began a phone friendship that lasted for months and months and months. I had no idea what story was there. Finally, after our long conversation, she said, "I want you to come to Connecticut. I want you to come stay in the home." She was still grieving the death of her husband. She said, "I want you to stay in the home that we shared for over 60 years. So I did. I flew into Hartford, rented a car, drove to Branford, found her home, and that first visit was the beginning of a deep friendship. I had no idea what the story was that I was going to hear. And so we went to nurseries, planted flowers, rode around the neighborhood, did everything for fun, good restaurants. She had no desire to work. This was not what she was there for. She was there, she had a traveling buddy, and she was there to have fun. But one day, she was just talking, and she talked about the time that she had met her husband when they were in Sobibor Death Camp. And when she started talking about it, I thought, oh my gosh, what story is this? Sobibor was one of 4 death camps that Hitler established. There were over 1,000 concentration labor camps, but 4 were built specifically to accomplish what he had sworn to do, which was to annihilate every Jew in Europe and then in the world. That was his plan. And so in order to do that, he built the 4 death camps. And this was where people were brought in by train, usually 1,500 to 2,000 at a time. They went from the train directly to the gas chambers. She was very fortunate because when she did get to Sobibor, they needed some workers. They always needed some workers around the camp to do the work of the camp. And so she was there. I'll read you about their first meeting. But there was a young man there that she had noticed. She was Dutch, he was Polish. They had no common language. But the first week she was at that camp, the SS guards had very strange ideas about humor. And so they would match up, they would do hideously brutal things that I won't even go into because they were so inhuman, actually. But this they did for fun one night. The musicians that were at the camp were told to bring their instruments, and they were to play dance music. All of the people who were prisoners there, although they were starving, although they were bedraggled, although they had been mistreated, they were ordered to dance. And they paired people up, you two, to dance. And they just happened to put Saartje was her Dutch name, Saartje Wijnberg with Engel. As I said, they spoke no common language, but in the book she says that the minute she stepped in his arms, she fell in love. He said the same thing, and they both said that love is what saved them from Sobibor Death Camp. But I want to read a couple of things to you. When I went to Branford the first time, she was so eager to talk because her family would not let her talk about him anymore. He had been dead 3 years. She had mourned. They were tired of it. They just said, we don't want to hear anymore. And that's why this book begins with these words. Many will not want to know my story. For some, it is too painful to face the darkness that can exist in the human heart. For others, bearing the grief of the past is the only way they can find the strength to build a future. I have heard that many even deny the truth of what I will tell you. For those who deny the truth of what I tell you, I can only say that I wish with every ounce of my being that this evil had not been born, that the millions who perish because of it could have lived out their normal lives. Evil denied and unconfronted spreads uncontrollably. It assumes a life of its own and feeds to full strength with every denial and failure to call it by its rightful name. And so she and her husband spent their lives talking about ignoring prejudice, talking about ignoring evil, and just as she said, if it's ignored, it spreads uncontrollably. And as she told me, we spoke in schools, and I saw stacks of letters from high school kids where they had spoken, also grammar school. She said, we spoke everywhere we could, and we would have talked from street corners. We went to churches, we went to synagogues, but if there was no place, then we just found a small group. And what they did was warn against ignoring evil. And I remember one special night of my first week at Sobibor more clearly than I remember yesterday. This was the night my life was changed forever. It was a cold, clear, early spring night. The SS guards not on duty stood at the edge of the roll call area, laughing and smoking, pointing at first one of us and then another. I thought they were deciding which prisoners were to dance and with whom, but I couldn't understand them. She spoke only Dutch, not German. We all stood in line waiting to be told our next move, or to be shot, or whipped for no reason. The musicians who had been ordered to play began to tune their instruments. The rest of us waited to see what would come next. We never knew. It often depended on a whim of one of the guards or an order not being obeyed by one of the prisoners. If ordered to dance, even if too sick or too weak, we still had to obey the order or join all the others who had gone to Camp 3. The camp was divided into the barracks for the SS guards, the prisoners, and then Camp 3 was the gas chamber. So when anybody was sent to Camp 3, they did not come back. The musicians began to play. I don't remember the music, but I do remember thinking it was good that something of such beauty could still exist, even here in the midst of such ugliness and death. They told the two of them to dance together. And this is again, suddenly in front of me stood a pair of dusty boots. and a soft voice spoke words I did not understand. Daring to raise my head, I looked into the kind eyes of a handsome young Polish man. I had noticed him before because there was an air of quiet confidence and control in spite of the constant horrors of this time and place. He smiled, took my hand gently in his, and led me where we were supposed to dance together. When I had not understood the order, they had then ordered this man to dance with me, and my heart still speaks to me, and I smile when I think of that night and my first dance with Hein. Hein told everybody as long as he lived that the moment he took me in his arms, he fell instantly in love with me. By the end of our first dance, he was more determined than ever to survive the hell of Sobibor and save me as well. In spite of the horrors of this place, the world seemed suddenly full of possibilities. Hope and dreams again fill me with a happiness that I had forgotten ever existed. In spite of the drifting ash and the smells from the fires, in spite of the hunger and the fear, in spite of everything that had gone before and that now surrounded us, this night was a new beginning for both of us. And after it was over, after the escape, they both gave that love full credit for their having survived not only the brutality of the SS guards, the deprivation, the whole thing. Neither of them could have done it without the other. I never heard him say those words, but she spoke for him, and she probably did when he was alive. She was a very strong, lovely, bossy lady. But it was, our friendship was deep. We argued. I went to the grocery store with her one time, and she sent me in for peanut butter. I brought it out. She said, this is not what I want. Go get so-and-so. I went back in. I brought back another thing of peanut butter. This is not what I want either. So I went in a third time, and I brought back the peanut butter. And she said, Ann, I said, I'm not taking that damn peanut butter back in, so don't ask me. I handed it to her, and she was little, about this high, but I mean, very, very strong. And so she got out of the car and slammed the door and walked in and got the right kind of peanut butter. She was fun. What?
How old was she then?
The first time I went up there, she died at 94. I put her book, this is her book, she calls it. I put her book in her hands for her 90th birthday. And we had the whole neighborhood, we had the rabbi, we had children, and we had grandchildren. It was quite the party. But I made 5 trips up, 3 times a year. Every page in this book was approved by her in writing. Not because I didn't trust her, but I wasn't sure how certain members of her family would look at this. And so I have her sign. She would read it, and the one time she was sick, I read it to her, but I wanted it to be I wanted to be sure that this was her story, so she approved of it. And if not, then I would change a few things. But she generally approved it, and if there were corrections to be made, I went back to Atlanta, where I was living at that time, made them, and my next trip up, I read to her, or she read on her own what had been changed. The descriptions of what happened in the camp and the Sobibor personnel are brutal enough that I won't go through them while I'm up here. But the way the prisoners were treated, to give you an example, there were 600 prisoners, give or take, at Sobibor Death Camp. And roll call was 5 o'clock. Roll call was the time for punishments and corrections, and it was to set an example of what happened if you did not do exactly as you were ordered to do, which they all did. But this roll call, they lined up every man in camp, and they said, we are going to shoot, and they did, every 10th man. Well, she had counted Selma, which was the name her grandmother had changed Saartje to, because it sounded less Jewish. She had counted, and by her count, he was the 10th man. And as they went down the line, she had no idea how she was going to survive without him, for one thing, not only because of the love, but because he was a survivor. He knew. He'd been in the Polish army, so he knew how to handle himself. He knew how to get extra food. He knew all that. And she almost fainted, but they walked by him and shot the man next to him in the forehead. But every 10th man in the camp was a victim of that. And then one of the guards had bragged that he had invented a whip that could beat a normal-sized Jew to death with 10 lashes. But if it were a smaller Jew, it would only take 8. That's to give you some general idea of the mentality of the people who were, well, of course, the death camps pulled in people who were inherently cruel, inherently sadistic, and so they enjoyed being in charge and being able to unleash this part of their character that would not, under normal circumstances, have been acceptable. The chapter in here on Sobibor personnel describes Gustav Wagner. He was a giant of a man. He was brutal. Any cruelty he was capable of. They tried to hide from him when he walked around the camp because any little thing would set him off. He actually, I believe, wound up in Brazil. They were not quite certain, but they know he did not die in the war. Heim was one of 3 people involved in planning the escape. Leon Feldhandler was the son of a rabbi. He was one. Sasha Pechersky was a Russian Red Army sergeant. He was 2. And there were several others who met silently, secretly, to plan the escape. And on October 14th, 1943, 300 prisoners escaped from Sobibor Death Camp. Only 47 survived the war. They ran for 10 days and nights, and I'm talking now about Selma and Heim. They ran by night and hid by day. In some cases, nobody would even give them a drink of water. In some cases, people would hide them. One instance, they were in a village where the SS troops searched every single house except the one where they were hiding. And the old lady who had said she would hide them had taken them to the root cellar, pulled out her bags of potatoes that she was saving through the winter, and put them in behind the potatoes. So chances are, even if they had come in that house, they wouldn't have seen them hiding there. But amazingly, and when we talk about miracles, what kind of miracle is that? That they searched every house in that village, but the one where they were hiding. And the people who would not even give them a drink of water, it was simply because they were Jewish. It had nothing to do with anything other than that. There was such tremendous hatred toward the Jews that Hitler had used it. If you ever read Mein Kampf, he planned how he was going to conquer Germany, Poland, and then the world. And one thing he needed was an archenemy that he could use to unite all the various countries. Well, he determined that the Jew was his archenemy. And the first thing that he did was dehumanize. They were no longer Jews. They were vermin. They were dogs. Anything that took their humanity away from them. And there was a guard at one camp who had trained his large St. Bernard called Man. And he had trained him to attack. Well, I don't know if you remember how large a St. Bernard is, but they're quite large, and a lot of the Jews, partially because of starvation, partially because of DNA, they were quite small. And he would, for his own sadistic pleasure, Man, his St. Bernard, get the dog. And so the dog would attack, and after that, there was no question that the person was going to ultimately die because the damage would have been so great. After the escape, they finally made it to Odessa, were able to get a ship home. They got there, and from there they went to Israel, waiting to come to the land of his dreams, which had always been America. And finally, in the early 50s, they were able to come to America. An attorney in Connecticut had sponsored them. That's the only way they could get there. But that was the beginning, she said, of their real life. This land of freedom, which they had never known, but which he had always dreamed of. After they settled here, he was a phenomenal businessman, made lots of money. They traveled and traveled and traveled, but would never set foot in either Germany or Poland. Those were two places. Everywhere else, all over the world, they traveled, but they would not go to those two countries. The part of this, I want to read what Selma, or Saartje, wanted to accomplish when we went. This was her book, I told you that. I was a conduit. And she considered it that way. This was her story. A lot of it was in her words. I have to translate. Incidentally, her recorded memories are in the Holocaust Museum in D.C. They're in the Hall of Remembrance, right at the top of the stairs. Her diary is there. She thought it was worth nothing. She told me she'd kept it for the 9 months they hid in the hayloft. And I'm almost as stubborn as she was, and I said, we are going to find it. We did. And then the next battle was to get her to donate it to the Holocaust Museum, which she finally did. But it was, and is, a piece of history. And the last part of this book is her diary. It was written in Dutch, and it was a heck of a job to find a translator who could translate Dutch and German into English. And Rob Creasy, C-R-O-E-S-I, of Creasy Translation Services, from Sturgis, Michigan, had never translated a diary before, but he translated this one. And when you read it, you will see. I tried 3 translators. They translated word for word. A good translator translates thoughts. And so he had, not only had he done it, but he had done a beautiful job of it. So we have a good history of that couple in the 9 months they spent in the hayloft. And then the neat thing is that new life. They conceived a child while they were in the hayloft. And there are times after that if you want to read about it, but I can't read it without crying, so I won't read it to you. It was a joy. It still is a joy. I miss her, but I talk to her about every 3 weeks, as long as she lived. And a great friend. And you know how you miss great friends.